what is the difference between Pilates and other exercise? Sometimes it feels like there is this secret code around Pilates. When you do a PT session, it seems it's a bit more straightforward. There's a lot of Pilates snobs around. Sometimes I want to tell them to shut up and go and do a mixed cardio session and some weights. All right, so what is the difference between Pilates and other exercise? So, all right, well, I think on a physiological, well, there are probably three layers that I could answer this on. The first one is, well, just if you kind of look at Pilates and then look at something like personal training, what are the differences? Well, I think about this a fair bit actually when I'm scrolling through Instagram, and I look at people doing Pilates on Instagram, and like you can kind of tell often they're moving slowly and they're going for this kind of graceful look, right? You know, like everything's kind of straight, but maybe the ballet fingers, you know, and legs are straight and, you know, and toes are pointed and generally, not always, but generally the movement is kind of slow and controlled. And, you know, I'm generalizing and not everybody, this doesn't apply to everybody doing Pilates, but I think that's my impression anyway. Whereas when I look at people doing personal training on Instagram, I see them doing these much faster movements with kind of a stereotyped, you know, athletic kind of look where they kind of do these, like they love doing these ones. Or they do all kinds of, you know, things like, you know, side lunges or whatever, but they're all into these kind of marching sort of movements where you step up onto a thing or step down onto a thing or lift a weight or whatever, but it's always with a march because that's sort of athletic. So, you know, and I'm sorry, I'm tarring all personal trainers and Pilates people with one brush, and I know that there are exceptions, but that's just my totally unscientific impression from scrolling through Facebook around the culture of how you know, should look or whatever when you're doing Pilates versus personal training. And a lot of the moves are actually very similar, right? If you do a lunge on the ground, well, what makes it Pilates in one class versus personal training in another class versus Zenga in another class versus, you know, Les Mills in another class? Like it's a lunge is a lunge is a lunge is a lunge, right? So you're working the same muscle groups. But okay, so what makes it Pilates or personal training in that particular context, I think, is just like the movement style, right? The aesthetic of it. So that's one thing. You know, Pilates, we tend to like to have little itty bitty weights, you know, in pastel colours. Personal training, we like to have bigger weights, typically black. You know, personal training, we like to use battle ropes. Pilates, we like to use flex bands. You know, so there are a lot of little kind of, I don't know, cultural, fashion sort of accessories and movement styles that go to differentiate them. All right, so in terms of, and also the outfits, right? The outfit you wear to Pilates is not the same as the outfit you wear to your personal training session necessarily. Although there's overlap there. All right, so now in terms of just like the physical differences, well, I think, typically in Pilates, you know, and this doesn't apply to everybody, and depends on if you're going to KX, it's different to if you're going to a more traditional, you know, classical Pilates studio. So obviously there's variety there. But I think typically in Pilates, if we kind of take KX Pilates, you know, out of the equation, it's much more focused on low load and movement quality, so moving smoothly and with fluidity and grace and control, and, you know, range of motion, you know, rather than, you know, reaching fatigue in certain muscle groups. Whereas in personal training, it's all about let's blast your delts, or let's blast your quads, or let's blast your abs, or let's blast your glutes. Now, we do a bit of that in Pilates as well, and some of that is sneaked in, but I think it's much more the case in personal training. So, you know, physiologically, could you do a Pilates class where you blast your delts and your glutes and your quads and your abs? Sure. I mean, that's KX Pilates, right? That's what you do there. And there's lots of other studios and styles that will do that as well. So I think, you know, the bottom line is, in physiologically, depends how you teach it, but basically there's minimal to no differences, right? Your muscles don't know whether they're working against a spring or against a barbell, right? They can't tell the difference. They just know there's tension, right? And tension's tension. So you're going to get stronger one way or the other. But lastly, I think there is a massive difference in one dimension, and that is the dimension of flow. And this I really got from my conversation with John Steele, the author of Caged Lion. Everybody who knows Chloe, quickly do a push-up. Where he was taught by Joseph Pilates directly. He's in his late 80s now, John Steele, and lives in Southern California. And he was taught by Joseph in New York, in Joseph's gym from 1962 to 1964 or 5. And his description, he's got this very rich description of doing Pilates with Joseph Pilates. And it was this fiercely concentrated mental effort to memorize and move through the routine with, trying to move through it with perfect poise and skill, right? With absolute perfection. And so it was this emphasis was not on how hard or not hard you worked. The emphasis was on trying to do it perfectly and be graceful, transitioning from that little ritual transitions from one exercise to the next. So it was like a dance, or it was like a yoga practice where a flow yoga practice where you're flowing from one move to the next. And so you get into flow. You get into that flow state where you are not thinking, where you're just existing in the moment and you're out of your mind. You have no thoughts. And I hope you've all had the glorious experience of being in that state, right? When you're working on something that is really challenging and you're just like in the zone doing, whether that's a physical thing or working on a project or, whatever it was, right? Thumbs up if you've had the flow experience, right? Well, I think that is what Pilates, at its best, brings us to, is that, and that's why we all say, it's good for my mind, not just my body, right? It calms me down. It gets me out of my stress. It stops my monkey brain, right? So I think that to me is the key difference with Pilates and PT.